Sir, at the time that you first found out about the atomic bomb, did you regard it as a curse or a blessing to mankind?
Well, I thought it was a blessing. I thought it could be used and made a blessing. I never worried about it being a curse. I wanted a weapon that could win the war, and it did. That's what I was interested in.
On July 19, 1957, at the Nevada test site, approximately 65 miles northwest of Las Vegas, 5 officers of the United States Air Force and 1 military cameraman stood in the open desert beneath a clear sky. They were positioned directly under the planned detonation point of a nuclear weapon. There was no trench, no blast shelter, and no attempt to obscure what was about to occur. A sign placed next to them read, "Ground Zero, Population 5. At 9 o'clock local time, an F-89J Scorpion interceptor aircraft piloted by Captain Eric William Hutchinson fired an AIR-2A Genie rocket. The rocket, powered by a Thiokol SR-49TC-1 solid-fuel motor, burned for roughly 2 seconds, accelerating the weapon to over Mach 3, then coasted upward for another 12 seconds before detonation. The warhead was a W-25, with an estimated yield between 1.5 and 2 kilotons, detonating at roughly 18,500 to 20,000 feet above ground. On the ground, the 6 men experienced a brief flash, followed seconds later by a shockwave. Dust rose. The pressure passed. None were knocked down. No visible injuries were recorded. The officers, Colonel Sidney C. Bruce, Lieutenant Colonel Frank P. Ball, Major John W. Hughes II, Major Norman B. Bottinger, and Major Donald A. Luttrell, and cameraman Akira George Yoshitake all survived. All lived for decades afterward. The test was designated Shot John, one of 29 nuclear detonations conducted during Operation Plumbob between May 28 and October 7, 1957. Plumbob was one of the largest and most varied nuclear test series ever conducted by the United States, involving 21 laboratories and government agencies and roughly 18,000 U.S. service members across multiple exercises. Shot John, however, was among the smallest detonations in the series, and by far the most carefully controlled. Just days earlier and later, Plumbob detonations occurred at dramatically higher yields and under far less constrained conditions. Shot Boltzmann, conducted on May 28, produced a yield of approximately 12 kilotons. Shot Franklin, on June 2nd, yielded roughly 140 kilotons, nearly 70 times more powerful than Shot John. Shot Hood, on July 5th, reached 74 kilotons, producing widespread fallout detected far beyond the test site. Then, on July 31st, 1957, only 12 days after Shot John, Plumbob conducted Shot Smokey. Smokey was a tower-mounted detonation with a yield of approximately 44 kilotons, more than 20 times the explosive power of Shot John. Unlike John's high-altitude airburst, Smokey detonated close enough to the ground to generate heavy dust, significant fallout, and intense radiation fields at low altitude. Thousands of U.S. Army soldiers were placed in trenches within several kilometers of Ground Zero and ordered to advance shortly after the blast. There was no sign, no name volunteers, no camera framing reassurance. Across Plumbob, other shots followed similar patterns. Priscilla at 37 kilotons, Diablo at 17 kilotons, Stokes at 19 kilotons, and Rainier, the first fully contained underground nuclear test, at 1.7 kilotons. Yields range from under 2 kilotons to well over 100, often with complex fallout behavior and unpredictable environmental effects. Seen in this context, Shot John was the exception, not the rule. It was the smallest nuclear detonation of the series. It was conducted at the highest altitude. It produced minimal fallout. Weather conditions were tightly constrained. Exposure time was deliberately limited. Every variable was optimized to make the outcome survivable. The test relied on basic physics that planners understood well. Energy from a nuclear detonation spreads outward from a single point, so as the distance from the explosion increases, that energy is distributed over a much larger area. As a result, blast pressure, thermal radiation, and prompt ionizing radiation all decrease roughly with the inverse square of the distance. Doubling the distance reduces intensity by about 4 times, tripling it by about 9 times. Applied to Shot John, this men standing 18,500 to 20,000 feet below the detonation were roughly 18 to 20 times farther from the burst than a reference distance of 1,000 feet, reducing the intensity of those effects by approximately 300 to 400 times. Radiation reaching the ground was further reduced by atmospheric absorption, and fallout remained minimal because the fireball never contacted the surface and did not draw large amounts of soil into the radioactive cloud. And crucially, it was the only plumb bob test designed explicitly as a demonstration rather than an experiment. The officers beneath Shot John were not standing under a typical nuclear weapon. They were standing under the most controlled nuclear detonation the United States could plausibly stage. Shot John took place during a period when above-ground nuclear tests served two purposes at once. They collected technical data, but they were also staged displays of control at a time when the Eisenhower administration was actively promoting the atom as both a weapon and a symbol of modern progress. In December 1953, President Eisenhower had introduced the Atoms for Peace initiative, framing nuclear technology as a source of civilian energy, scientific advancement, and international leadership, even as nuclear weapons testing continued at scale. Tower shots, balloon shots, and airbursts were filmed deliberately, with mushroom clouds presented as evidence of mastery rather than catastrophe. Shot John fit into that context, except its subject was not a structure or a target, but people placed deliberately in frame to suggest that nuclear power, when properly controlled, could be lived under as well as feared. What Shot John showed was not what nuclear weapons usually did, but what they could be made to look like under ideal conditions. Within the same test series, only days apart, the United States detonated weapons tens of times more powerful, closer to the ground, in environments where control gave way to exposure and reassurance gave way to data collection. Shot John sold the idea that nuclear weapons were manageable. That reassurance mattered because nuclear air defense was expected to operate directly over American cities. The Genie was designed to detonate near incoming bombers after they crossed U.S. airspace, not at distant borders. Shot John was meant to answer a concrete fear. If nuclear weapons had to be used overhead, what would that mean for the people below? Smokey and the rest of Plumb Bob tested what that belief actually meant. Unlike Shot John, these later detonations were conducted at far lower altitudes or on towers, with yields tens of times greater and in conditions that could not be tightly controlled. Shots like Hood, Priscilla, and Smokey generated heavy dust clouds and measurable fallout, with radioactive material carried well beyond the Nevada test site by shifting winds. Environmental monitoring existed, but real-time exposure information for troops and nearby populations was limited, and long-term medical follow-up was not systematically implemented. Health assessments focused on immediate injury, not delayed effects. These tests became practical templates for how nuclear weapons would be used near populated regions. Fallout from Plumb Bob was later detected in downwind communities in Nevada, Utah, and beyond, exposing civilian populations who had no role in the tests and no access to the data being collected. In that sense, Plumb Bob marked a transition from staged demonstrations of control to operational experiments whose consequences extended beyond the test site, shaping both military doctrine and the lived experience of nuclear exposure for thousands of civilians. Within months, more than 3,000 nuclear-armed Genie missiles were deployed at 31 interceptor bases across the United States with, and that's the most surprising, little public resistance. Nuclear technologies were still pretty new. People were mostly uneducated on the matter, and the full scope of risk was yet to be thoroughly apprehended and studied. In that sense, the demonstration did exactly what it was designed to do: reassure the American public and give room for experimentation to the U.S. government. However, that same logic began to collapse between 1959 and 1962. As Soviet R-7 and R-16 intercontinental ballistic missiles entered service, U.S. planners shifted focus from bomber interception to missile warning and deterrence. Nuclear air defense rapidly lost strategic relevance. Genie-armed interceptors remained in service into the late 1980s, way after the scenario Shot John was meant to justify. Nuclear detonations over U.S. cities had disappeared along with the need to reassure the public. If you want more analyses of how specific tests were used to shape public acceptance of nuclear policy, please consider subscribing. And if Shot John reassured 1950s America, what do you think is its modern equivalent today?